Okay, welcome everybody. Hello and good morning. Welcome to the United States Embassy and High Commission of Canada's partnership event in celebration of Women's History Month. I want to especially welcome our U.S. Ambassador, Linda Tagliatella of the Barbados, Eastern Caribbean and OECS, the Canadian High Commissioner Designee Lillian Chatterjee. I want to welcome Steve Jaltma from the Canadian High Commission, our expert panelists, UN Women's Representative Tonni Brodber, Dr. Radix, and Dr. Bobb from UE. I also want to welcome the U.S. Embassy's Public Affairs section, as well as the U.S. Embassy's Diversity and Inclusion Committee for helping to put our event together. Protocol having been established, welcome everybody. Today's virtual panel will bring together 3 Eastern Caribbean experts at the top of their respective fields to discuss the gender economic disparity that is endemic in the global labor market. Today's discussion will also be bookended by our U.S. Ambassador as well as the Canadian High Commissioner. Each panelist will present for about 15 to 20 minutes, leaving 15 to 20 minutes for a question and answer session. So please write down your questions throughout the program, as we will get to as many as time permits. While many individual women have accomplished laudable and glass ceiling shattering firsts, garnering global accolades and admiration, perhaps most notably Prime Minister Mia Mottley, US Vice President Kamala Harris, German Chancellor Angela Merkel, and the World Trade Organization's Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, to name but a few, most women around the world remain underpaid, undervalued, and frequently passed over for promotion relative to their male counterparts. Today's discussion will highlight not only some of the realities of the imbalance, but more importantly, it will offer an opportunity to begin to close the equality gap as the Eastern Caribbean and world prepare to move beyond the pandemic. However, first I have the honor of introducing our U.S. Ambassador to Barbados, the Eastern Caribbean, and the OECS. As a female leader herself, she is well attuned to the plight of women in the workplace, both individually as well as in her capacity as having led many teams up to and including the embassy community here in Barbados. Madam Ambassador, it is my pleasure and welcome.
Thank you, Brianna. It's a pleasure to be here today. I'd like to say good morning to everyone and welcome you to this virtual panel to celebrate Women's History Month. I am pleased to be here with our embassy, diversity, and the High Commissioner from Canada, and our expert panels. Today's women's labor movement has showcased the history of gender imbalance in the workplace. For example, the 1911 Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire, which killed 146 female garment workers in New York City, led to improved safety standards to protect workers. The Radium Girls, female factory workers who contacted radium poisoning from painting watch dials, led to the establishment of occupational disease labor laws. And the Lilly Ledbetter Fair Pay Act of 2009 expanded the ability for women to be paid equally. This March marks another anniversary. It has been a full year since the coronavirus has declared a global pandemic by the World Health Organization. Though it goes without saying that COVID-19 has completely upended all our daily lives, over the next 90 minutes, we will talk specifically about how women have been impacted. For instance, women make up the majority of domestic workers and tourism workers, and both sectors have been very hard hit by the pandemic, especially throughout the Eastern Caribbean. As schools and daycares have moved from classroom to living rooms, it has overwhelmingly been up to women to provide childcare, often at the expense of paid employment. However, where there's inequality, there's great opportunity. As we begin to put the pandemic behind us, thanks to the vaccinations, social distancing, and mask wearing, and as we rebuild our economies, we can better invest in women. We can strengthen programs that promote women's economic independence. We can promote equal access to technology and financial services. And we can prioritize supporting families, which will disproportionately support women. Again, I want to thank you for being here and thank you for celebrating Women's History Month with us. I look forward to a wonderful discussion. Wishing you all an enjoyable morning.
Thank you so much, Madam Ambassador. I now have the privilege of introducing our first panelist, Tonni Brodber, who is currently the representative of the UNWomen Multi-Country Office in the Caribbean. Prior to her appointment in August 2020, Ms. Brodber served as the Deputy Representative for 5 years with the MCO Caribbean. She has previously worked as the team leader for advancing gender justice in the Pacific Program with UNWomen Fiji Multi-Country Office, and is a gender specialist for the United Nations Development Program in South Africa, as well as briefly with the UNWomen in South Africa Multi-Country Office, and has established what is now the UN Women Country Office in Haiti. Please welcome Representative Brodber.
Thank you so much, Chairwoman. It's a real pleasure to be here this morning speaking to this issue. And I really share the Ambassador's positive outlook on the fact that we are going to be coming to a way in which we can overcome the COVID-19 crisis through vaccination and social distancing. And while we are approaching that end in sight, we do need to be quite aware of where the economic disparities lie so that when we build back from COVID-19, we're building back equal. As many people are probably already aware, at least 47 million women and girls have been pushed into poverty as a result of the pandemic. And in the Caribbean, this is balanced to a certain extent by the fact that before the pandemic, there was a debt burden, and there is a debt burden. We have a persistent debt burden that undermines a lot of economic empowerment opportunities for women and men. Women and men differently because of the ways in which women and men engage differently with the economy. We're seeing diminished opportunities for social protection, as well as reduced public services and stagnant public sector wages as a result of this debt burden. In the Caribbean right now, as the ambassador also spoke to, you'll find women in very particular sectors. Women are often in the services sector, in the tourism sector, in the healthcare sector, working as well in the informal sector. And even though women pursue education more than men and they have increased certification, they are still underemployed and underpaid. So we're still seeing that women need more certification for the same wages that men have. Also, women are less likely to be employers. Although the ILO did a survey quite recently that showed that the Caribbean led globally with regards to women in management positions, these management positions were generally mid-management position. And when you look at who are self-employed, yes, women are self-employed, but those who have employees are 1% of those who are self-employed. So most women are in own account businesses. They're also in businesses related to textile, food, retail, hotel, and restaurants, as well as the transport sector, all of which are aligned to tourism. Women are also overrepresented, as I said earlier, as mid-level managers. And the employment rate in the Caribbean, as you can see, was also one that, again, in spite of the education that women were achieving, was lower for women than for men across the board. What COVID-19 has done is exploit a lot of the weaknesses and inequalities that existed before. So we have widespread but unequal job loss. We're seeing women still losing jobs more than men across the Caribbean countries that participated in an IDB online socioeconomic survey. From Barbados to the Bahamas, you'll see that women lost jobs at a higher rate than men did, except in Trinidad and Tobago. And Suriname, it was slightly less. And I think, again, this is linked to the fact of where women are in the economy. A lot of women are in the sectors that were the most hit by COVID-19. One of the unique natures of the Caribbean and poverty in the Caribbean, and perhaps it's not that unique, but it is something that is quite very clear, glaring in the region, is that poverty is not only an issue that is related to income. It is about the way in which vulnerabilities intersect. And because of the way in which different vulnerabilities intersect in the Caribbean, based on the deep-rooted social, economic, and cultural disparities, we see women being affected more by the impact of COVID-19 than men, even though across the board, it's been an 81% loss of income for informal domestic workers as well in the Latin American Caribbean region. And so a lot of those women who are engaged in the informal sector as well are clearly at risk. We don't like to speak too often about the tit for tat. Gender equality and the work towards gender equality is not saying that only women are suffering. But what we're trying to do with this lens is explain why, in many cases, women may be suffering more than men, and in other cases, why men may be suffering differently and more than women, depending on the circumstance. What the lens is telling us, because of the stereotypes around the gender roles that women are expected to play, women have also been hit hardest when it comes to unpaid care work, because even before COVID-19, women were also the most responsible for unpaid care work. So the lockdowns, as well as homeschooling and the restrictive movement, have meant that the unpaid care responsibilities that women have are increasingly becoming a burden. Homeschooling, as it pertains to homeschooling, you're seeing women having an increase of 68.5%, whereas men had an increase of 24.6%. So we really need to be working on not only external to the household, understanding the macroeconomic and microeconomic changes that need to be made to promote gender equality, but what is happening in households as well around sharing care, especially sharing the care of the elderly and children. The shadow pandemic of COVID-19, and I'm actually at this stage thinking we should stop calling it a shadow pandemic. It was a pandemic before COVID-19. What COVID-19 has done is put an additional spotlight on what was happening. In the Caribbean, the numbers are as high as many places in the world. And unfortunately, in Guyana, it is 55% of women who have experienced violence in their lifetime, and this in an intimate partner relationship. And this is critical for us to understand what is happening now with regards to COVID-19 restrictions, because often the home for many may be a place of refuge, but when you had COVID-19, and if you're experiencing any kind of intimate partner violence or family violence more broadly, you have refuge at work, you have refuge with your friends, and sometimes this enables you to be able to get the courage to leave a situation that is quite difficult. Unfortunately, that is not the case with COVID-19. And what we've been seeing across the Caribbean is an increase in the reports, into police reports, and to the calls that are hotlines for the pandemic. In Trinidad and Tobago, the year-on-year increase for June, just the calls for the year-on-year increase for June 2020 was 149%. And in Barbados, this is something I do want to correct again on record, it's 38%. During the first lockdown in 2020, these were the increase in reports to the police. And in Anguilla, it was 125% in March and 88% in April. This is what women are living through in their houses. And the reason I spoke to that is because domestic violence is also an issue of economic empowerment and a source of the economic disparity that women are facing. In the US, data has demonstrated how many days lost, 8 million days of paid work lost as a result of domestic violence. And it is costing countries at least 368 million based on data from New Zealand. Often, many abusers use the workplace as well as a site of control. And so many women stop going to work or lose their jobs as a result of intimate partner violence. So what are we doing? What is positive? There's a lot of good things happening. There are a lot of good things happening in the Caribbean. In Trinidad and Tobago, pandemic leave was passed, which allowed for flexi time and remote working, along with paid work so that persons could take care of their care responsibilities. Retraining has been happening in Barbados with tourism workers, but predominantly many of those tourism workers are women. And in Barbados, 81% of the hotel workers were estimated to not be working in April 2020 as a result of the UNDP, UNICEF, UNWomen Heat Report series survey that looked at the fact that 81% of people weren't working. So this retraining program is extremely useful. We brought in another South-South example from Togo as something that we can also look a little bit more to in the Caribbean. They started looking at an equitable approach to assistance for informal workers using M-Money, mobile money, and cash transfers directly to informal workers, with women, of course, and receiving more of the payouts because women were more of the informal workers. They just had to demonstrate that they had a valid ID card as well as the loss of income. Excuse me. Also, through the Engender Project, which is supported by the Government of Canada and the UK Aid, as well as led by UNDP with UNWomen and SEDIMA and WFP, we've been able to give grants and transfers to women and men in agricultural and tourism sectors. And these are some of the immediate infusions of support that can support persons' livelihoods so that they can build back from the impacts of COVID-19. In Antigua and Barbuda, 502 tourism hampers were provided, 399 women received them, and 103 men. If you look at what happened in St. Lucia, we're looking at 60 tourism grants, of which 50 women will benefit from tools and equipment as well in the agricultural sector. And in Dominica, 2 women farmer communities in the Kalinago community and Campbell will be supported through this program. What we're really thinking is, where do we go from here? And how can we make sure that these economic disparities that have been described above and how people have been impacted by COVID-19 are addressed? We need to be looking at social protection more broadly. A lot of the unpaid care work challenges will be able to be solved by gender and shock responsive social protection. We need to be also looking at the quality of the public services that are provided and how they are linked to social protection. Barbados already has paid childcare. This is something that all countries should be looking into in terms of how to support families to ensure that they can contribute in the public economy and the formal sector, while also meeting their responsibilities in the care economy and the informal care economy. We need to be looking at infrastructure, building back smarter, building back in an innovative way. In the retraining that we do, we need to be ensuring that women are in growth sectors, in the ICT sectors. We need to also be working on safe spaces and safe cities so that women feel that they can engage publicly to really reduce those economic disparities that they're experiencing right now and will continue to experience through COVID-19. We can build back better, and these are some of the ways in which we can do so. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was really wonderful. Next up, we have Dr. Carlene Radix. Dr. Radix is the current head of Human and Social Division at the OECS. The Human and Social Division encompasses health, education, social protection, and procurement of essential medicines and medical supplies for the region. She completed medical school at St. George's University in Grenada and completed a combined internal medicine and pediatric residency in the United States, followed by an occupational medicine and environmental health fellowship, during which she completed her master's degree in public health. She returned to the Caribbean and has held various positions in clinical medicine, academia, public health and administration, and has consulted for regional and international public health agencies. Please welcome Dr. Radix.
Thank you so much. I'm hoping that you can hear me. Great. I've been having a bit of trouble with my internet connection. Allow me to recognize the ambassador and the High Commissioner, as well as my esteemed colleagues on the panel. So I'm going to share my screen. Okay. Yeah, excuse me for a moment. I'm just going to stop my camera before I share my screen so that if there's an issue with the internet connection, it won't be affected. So I'm going to share one more time. Great. I hope you can all hear me and that you're seeing my presentation. So it's really a pleasure to join this group and to speak about gender economic disparity in the Eastern Caribbean. My hope in the next 15 to 20 minutes is just to have a conversation about women and specifically health. As you can tell, my background is in health. And the burden of chronic diseases on the global population is certainly one that speaks to this topic about economic disparity in the Eastern Caribbean. So I wanted to start the conversation about men versus women. Maybe that's not quite the way to say it, but what really is the difference between men and women? You know, why all this discussion about the differences in gender? And so this is one lens in which to look at it, men versus women. Really, this organ is a big difference between men and women. It's our reproductive organ. Not that men don't have similar um, reproductive organs that have to work together to reproduce, but with women, we seem to carry the privilege and the burden associated with reproduction. So, what do I mean by this? First of all, I think our reproductive system is quite inefficient in that women have, in their lifetime, an average of 350 to 500 periods during the course of their life in order to be able to give birth to 10 children. And then women carry children to term. So 9 months of pregnancy in order to carry children. But our children are born without the ability to care for themselves. And so caring for children, again, falls to women. At least in the first year of life, women are the ones that can provide nutrition through breastfeeding. And because the human being takes a long time to be fully developed, the course of caring of a child until they become an adult again seems to fall within the privilege and the burden of women. So this and all the things surrounding this tends to be around the conversation of the differences between men and women. But I want to talk about what's the same, because sometimes we get caught up in what is different among our health issues and we forget about what is the same. And so, for both men and women, chronic diseases, and by chronic diseases, we mean heart disease, chronic lung disease, cancer, hypertension, diabetes, and mental health conditions, are the biggest burden to our health for both men and women. NCDs are responsible for 71% of all deaths, 71 to 80%, depending on what you read, all deaths worldwide. I have two infographics here. One is coming from a public health agency, one is coming from an advocacy group. But the point is the numbers stay the same, okay? 40% of people who die from NCDs die in their most productive years. And we know that the risk factors include unhealthy diet, tobacco use, issues around air pollution, harmful use of alcohol, physical inactivity. So 3 enduring myths, according to the WHO, to the neglect of NCDs in women is first, the persistent view that health-related issues of importance to women are defined through their reproductive capacity. And while, like I said, the privilege and the burden increases health issues, we are still whole people. And like men who have some reproductive issues, there are many other issues in the whole person to be taken into account when we look at health. Second is the misperception that NCDs, especially cardiovascular disease or heart disease, are primarily diseases of men. And third, the myth that chronic diseases are only issues of women from high-income countries as a result of lifestyle choices. So let's debunk some of these myths. And looking at entities and women globally, heart disease is the #1 killer of women globally. Heart disease, it's the #1 killer of men, it's the #1 killer of women. We have this in common. 1 in 3 women will die from heart disease, but 80% of the deaths are preventable. And if we go a bit wider, if we look at leading causes of death, we get heart disease, stroke, lung cancer, chronic lung disease, and breast cancer as leading causes of death. Again, repeating cardiovascular disease being a #1 cause of death. We know about cancers, diabetes, women being disproportionately affected and affected during pregnancy, chronic respiratory disease. In some areas of the world, women are cooking in places and spaces where they're exposed to burning fuel that affects the lungs, and certainly around mental health conditions that affect women. I just wanted to take a moment to look at what are the issues around some of the risk factors, men versus women, for chronic diseases. And if we look, this is looking at a PAHO paper that looked at worldwide versus the Americas in terms of some of the issues that we have. And you can see both worldwide and in the Americas, women have less or suffer more from insufficient physical activity. Certainly, they're on par with men with regards to overweight and obesity. But when we get to the larger extremes of obesity, women have higher rates. Men take the lead in terms of alcohol and heavy episodic drinking, but we know in the Caribbean it's been increasing in terms of women. We're on par with regards to cholesterol, glucose, and issues around raised blood pressure. So the risks are similar between the genders. And then I wanted to take a look here at what happened. This is looking at the percentage change in years of life lost in countries of the Americas between 2000 and 2012 by gender. So we're looking at low and middle income countries and high income countries. And what you're seeing here is what is the percentage change. So what is the percentage change in years of life lost? So a negative number is a good thing. That means less years of life lost happened in 2012 than in 2000. So in the low and middle income countries, there was a big dent made in communicable maternal, perinatal, and nutritional conditions for both men and women between 2000 and 2012. And in high income countries, there was basically no change, probably because these were not the areas in which there was a burden. I make the note that here, these numbers in the positive means that there was an increase in the years of life lost between 2000 and 2012. And there was an increase across the board. But the increase in lower and middle income countries was much more than in the high income countries. And then if we look to injuries, again, we saw somewhat of an increase here. This is where the biggest change happened around, safety and other issues in high-income countries. So I just thought that was interesting to show that the burden of NCDs goes across the board for men and for women in low, middle, and high-income countries, but the burden is greater in low and middle-income countries. And as has already been said by my colleague, women as caregivers are on the front line. And this doesn't just mean women informally as caregivers, women at home caring for children or parents or sick relatives, but women who drop their children off at a place for care are often delivering them into the hands of other women. Women who are hired in the caregiving sector formally are at the front lines. And as has been said, women account for 70% of health and social workers at the front line of COVID-19. Taking it to the Caribbean, and I have this little sort of island icon here to remind us of the vulnerabilities that my colleague spoke to, that our small island developing states have to deal with. And these include issues of exposure to disasters, including hurricanes, volcanic eruption, earthquakes, and of course, health disease outbreaks. We've had Zika, chikungunya, and of course the COVID-19 pandemic that is sweeping the world. And our economies that are so dependent on things like tourism and the services sector that are also vulnerable. So it's no different. NCD mortality in the Caribbean is the highest in all of the Americas. And on average, people in the CARICOM countries have lower life expectancy at birth. 40% of NCD deaths occur prematurely in those under 70. And we talk about heart attack, stroke, diabetes, and cancers being leading causes of death. Hypertension, a leading risk factor, and diabetes prevalences are double in some cases in our region. And when we look at gender, we see that women have higher rates of diabetes. They're more likely to be obese in our countries. While men have lower rates of health service utilization, worse control of their chronic conditions, and higher rates of death and disability. And this still impacts women who often have to be the caregivers for men who are burdened by NCDs. And as we've said before, men have higher rates of harmful use of alcohol and tobacco. So I wanted to speak to the story in our region by just sharing 3 stories, because the data, there is data, but the data is sporadic and limited. And so I'm going to share some anecdotal data of my own experience with regards to women and NCDs. So the first photo I have there is of a woman, looking unwell, holding her stomach, holding her chest. And I put there women presenting with indigestion. A lesson that I learned early on in my career, when a woman presented, and I was the shadowing student, with symptoms, and she herself downplayed, and that the physician sort of said, oh, it's stress and you have stomach issues, etc. And she left our emergency room and died of a heart attack. And I've seen that scenario play over and over again because I had that exposure early on. I know I'm attuned to the fact that when women have any kind of chest or stomach pain, the number 1 killer of women is cardiovascular or heart disease, and it needs to come to our minds. But the truth is, even for the women themselves, they're likely to downplay those symptoms or to think of some other diagnosis. And when presenting, physicians may also not consider cardiovascular disease as a first thought. The next photo reminded me of a case that I knew of a woman who chose to take care of her alcoholic brother. He needed quite a lot of medications, and I remember having a conversation with her in which she said, I can't buy my hypertensive medications this month because I need to make sure that he has the medications that he needs in order to stay alive. And so again, you have women in these positions of being caregivers and of giving up their own care in lieu of others. And my final picture here is to remind me of my grandparents. My grandfather was a physician, the first in a long line of which I am in a family of physicians. But I always remembered that growing up, that while my grandfather would be seeing patients, my grandmother would be attending to a lot of the small ails that we had, and often with things that she could pick from the backyard and boil. And so I just say that to say that women have had a long history much of the information being lost with regards to caregiving, and they take on a lot of the burden with regard to NCDs. Speaking to COVID-19 and NCDs, we note that, as we all know, persons with NCDs are at greater risk for death and disability due to COVID-19. There's been disruptions in service, supply of medications and equipment for testing, etc., that have made chronic diseases more difficult to manage during the pandemic. Due to issues of isolation and stress factors, we heard about the increased issues of violence. We know there's increased use of alcohol and tobacco as coping mechanisms, and that decrease in physical activity, poor nutrition, and increased risk factors for weight gain. And women have again taken on the carer role in the COVID-19 for family, friends, for persons who are sick, for children at home, and with the economic issues of persons losing jobs, or sometimes families having to leave the islands to seek health care around complications around chronic diseases and leaving their children with family in this COVID-19 era. But as the ambassador said earlier, COVID-19 also brings with it opportunities. Some of these include flexible working arrangements, which I think will be of benefit to women moving forward, access to education, issues around telemedicine, and alternative supply chain practices that hopefully will continue so that persons have better access to what they need to manage their conditions, and somewhat of a refocus on family and community. So what is being done with regards to NCDs? I thought I couldn't speak without speaking to what's happening. Of course, there is the SDG target 3.4 to reduce by 1/3 premature mortality from NCDs through prevention and treatment, and to promote mental health and well-being. There's a global action plan to 2020, I think we've extended to 2025, for a world free of avoidable burden of NCDs. We know of the Port of Spain Declaration in 2007 in the Caribbean, and we know of the Healthy Caribbean Coalition's recent call to action as a result of COVID-19, NCDs and COVID-19 in the Caribbean, a transformative new NCD agenda. There's also been a specific call to action with to have specific attention to the needs of women and girls and the impact of NCDs, making sure that we integrate NCD prevention, treatment, and control into existing health programs, advocate for universal coverage, advocate for gender-based approaches to make sure that women are not left behind, and evidence-based approaching to looking at women. So what do I want you to know about women and NCDs? That women die and are disabled by NCDs globally and in all economic spheres, just like men are, just like we all are. Women take on the burden of caregiving, formal and informal, as a result of NCDs and make decisions at the expense of their own health. They face disparities in care when presenting and may be less able to afford or access due to existing disparities. And just a reminder that while reproductive health is important, women's health is not just reproductive health, but she is a whole woman. Some takeaways: we need more information about women and NCDs in the Eastern Caribbean. Are we ensuring that we continue to disaggregate by age and gender? Women have an active role to play in the formal and informal healthcare system and must continue to play a transformative role in the system. And COVID-19 presents both a threat and an opportunity for us to transform our health and our health systems. So I'll leave it there, and thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you so much, Dr. Radix. That was really insightful and very helpful. Very well done. For our last panelists, I am pleased to introduce Dr. Daniele Bobb, who is a temporary lecturer at the Institute for Gender and Development Studies, the Nita Barrow Unit at the University of the West Indies Cave Hill campus. Her PhD thesis focused on women's negotiation and navigation of motherhood and work within a neoliberal context. Dr. Bobb's research and academic interests include gender and development, government and social policies, mothering, women, and work. In this vein, she assisted with the updating of the gender equality policy and operational strategy at the Caribbean Development Bank, and has worked on many regional research projects, including the compilation of data on gender relations and a critical analysis, review, and evaluation of the existing national gender policies and action plans across CARICOM under the Improved Access to the Justice Impact Project. Please welcome Dr. Bobb.
Thank you so much, Brianna, and good morning to everyone. I do appreciate such a kind welcome. It is really a pleasure to be in the company of such brilliant minds, doing amazing work in the region. This work that we're doing today began a very long time ago, and it's built on the shoulders of so many women. It is only right that, we acknowledge those who fought battles seen and unseen, and whose backs really took the brunt of the lashes as we fought for the rights of women and children, especially coming out of the decade for women in 1975 to 1985, because we are really forever grateful to them. And so this morning's session, as we're looking at gender and economic disparity in the Eastern Caribbean, we're taking, my presentation in particular, takes a look at the COVID-19 pandemic and women's work in Barbados. This being, of course, Women's History Month, I could not miss the opportunity to just remember some of the women who were so influential, especially in the post-independence period, who did a lot of work in the region. And our history really documents these activists, women activists and scholars in relation to gender equality and women and development in the region. These women have been on many platforms, formally and informally, and this picture here showcases women such as Peggy Ann Trobus, Rosina Wilshire, Barbara Bailey, Dame Billy Miller, Dame Nita Barrow, Professor Eugene Barrow, among others that we can see here. And, what we are not seeing, or who's not included in this collage, is really the myriad of other women and others who've been advocating at that grassroots level, who's been challenging the structures upheld by laws and politics and economics and cultural myths for such a long time. And just to say that, we have really for years been fighting for gender equality and equity, because we recognize that women have been disadvantaged and positioned as inferior, as secondary. And what COVID-19 has really done is really, blown the lid off the jar of worms and amplified existing gender, class, race inequalities, and have really shown many realities, including the disproportionately devalued and unfair positions of women in the labor market, especially in relation to men. It's also shown the pivotal contribution of women's care work to the economy, and how much the economy is built on this unpaid care work, mostly done by women. So COVID-19 has really forced us to pause, to assess, to rethink, to recalibrate. It has highlighted that, this devalued work is the basis of the economic world. It's illuminated the gendered structure of our societies and the need for women's voices to be included in the decision-making process. How so? Well, let me illustrate a little bit by looking at some of the major sectors affected by this pandemic. So we look at the tourism industry. In Barbados in 2020, we've heard many reports that indicate 81% of employees in the hotel industry were reported to not be working. This is what Tonni spoke about earlier in her presentation. And so we expect that, the backlash of this is that women will be disproportionately affected in this tourism sector. What is also important to note is that 62% of the tourism workers in Barbados are women, but they have been paid significantly less than men. In fact, they get paid about 68% of men's wages. And so the vast majority of vulnerable workers in tourism are women, about 85% of them. And a majority of workers belong below the poverty line in tourism are also women. So women are the group most impacted by the shutdown of this tourism sector. Now, children who live in poverty disproportionately live in households in which women are the primary income earners. So that what we're seeing is an increase in women in poverty will significantly increase the number of children living in poverty. It means that the shift to online education in the short run will unduly affect children who live in poverty. And we'll come back to that a bit later. Let's talk about a little bit about the healthcare. Now, according to the World Health Organization, as Dr. Radix and also Tonni mentioned, we have women making up 70% of the healthcare workforce. But where are these women located? Most are in the nursing department, the nursing section, and they're also located in the healthcare support occupations. You have women who are cooks, cleaners, clerks. Yet even though they comprise that majority of the industry, it's still an industry led by men. In fact, research shows that 69% of global health organizations are headed by men and 80% of board chairs are men. This is not new. This is what we've been saying over the years is very harmful to women and by extension our economies. So clearly with the pandemic now, women are more exposed to a greater risk of infection, but also there is a discursive entanglement whereby the protocols of managing the pandemic have taken away childcare options for these women because, our schools and our nurseries are closed. But they also are located in a profession that really does not permit them to work from home. So what are the economic implications of COVID-19? Well, the reports and the newspaper articles, and if you check the government information system website, they tell us that as of March 3rd, 2021, the Barbados National Insurance Office received over 50,000 unemployment claims since March last year. And these are just persons who qualify for unemployment. There are some 4,000 who did not qualify. Now remember, according to the Country Living Conditions Report, women make up the majority of poor and are located quite heavily, as Tonni mentioned, in the informal sector. So there's no huge savings for them to rely on to absorb the financial shock of job loss or salary cuts. Also, if we look at the accommodation and food service industry, a high percentage of workers whose incomes are below we see a high percentage of workers whose incomes are below $700 Bajan or between 700 and 900 Bajan dollars. A large share of these workers are women, particularly in the vulnerable category. There also exists a significant gender wage gap in the tourism industry. According to the IADB's survey of living conditions, men's average income in that sector was about 2,600 Bajan dollars, while for women it was on average 1,768. We know there's an estimation that we'll see incomes in tourism falling by up to 32%. And this means that the decline affects low-income workers more severely and pushes vulnerable tourism workers into poverty. And as we stated earlier, who comprise that group? Women. In addition, 54% of those who were part-time, according again to the IADB Survey of Living Conditions 2016-2017, are women. Women also are more likely to be underemployed. Now, what all of this information is suggesting is that women are more detachable from the workforce and are more likely to bear the burden of unemployment during the crisis. There are significant challenges for all. During this pandemic, it's been difficult on everyone, but it's more difficult for women, for a lot of women. Women have a higher risk of job and income loss. And research tells us that career breaks have long-term impacts on women's labor market prospects, and women often return to lower paid and skilled positions. As Tonni also indicated and showed the statistics, women are exposed to gender-based violence, intimate partner violence, abuse, harassment during times of crisis and quarantine, that tends to increase. As women, again, being the primary caregiver in homes, are forced to choose between childcare and their jobs as schools are online and daycares are closed. So let's talk a little bit more about women's unpaid care work. This work of caring for people is dismissed by society as most unproductive. The coronavirus pandemic has shown even more clearly how the effective functioning of Caribbean societies is heavily reliant on this unpaid intimate work, to the point that it becomes a silent referent in state rhetoric and policies. Women are largely deemed to be responsible for the care, protection, and upbringing of children. This means that in times of crisis, mothers and other women caregivers are the ones expected to shoulder the responsibility of ensuring children in the household are being provided for. What feminist and activist groups have been arguing is that the perception of this labor as love and natural absolves state responsibility, and we saw it highlighted clearly here. These extended school closures put a strain on mothers, especially single mothers who work in essential sectors, given that they are the primary caregiver in the household. They provide a disproportionate share of housework and are in charge of looking after children or vulnerable members of the household. Even in dual parent households, the imbalance in domestic responsibilities remains skewed, and COVID-19 intensified this. School closures combined with social distancing, stay-at-home measures mean mothers cannot rely on schools, daycare centers, or informal childcare provided by relatives. They have to juggle paid work and care responsibilities such as homeschooling their children, caring for them, caring for other dependents in the household like the elderly, cleaning, cooking, washing, managing the emotional and mental health of others. This is what we take for granted, but this is what is pivotal to the strategies implemented by the government to curb the spread of COVID-19. In other words, the government depends on this labor. Let me give you an example. So when asked about the fact that childcare provision had not been addressed in the phased reopening of the economy in 2020, Prime Minister, Your Honorable Mia Motley response illustrated that, again, the economy was reliant on the unpaid intimate care work of largely women. And she says here, "We are asking truthfully the extended family to play a role." This is Mia talking. This is not the Prime Minister talking. If you have family, help out one another. That is what family is for. It may well be that you can't go by your parents because they're at risk, but you have a cousin, a nephew, a niece, somebody, because that is the Bajan way. So let's do it. Now, no mention is made here of support to be given for those who are unable to rely on extended family network, such as immigrants or people who have been disowned by family members due to a marginalized aspect of their identity, or whose family members may have also been called back out to work, or perhaps parents who have children with disabilities that require special care and attention. All of these is important for us to note, because we have to ask ourselves, who are we excluding when we develop these policies? This situation has exacerbated the inequitable division of labor in households across the island. For example, we have cases where older siblings, especially girls, are being asked to tend to other children, as well as to perform household duties, which infringes on their own educational advancement. We have parents who have had to go back to work as essential workers. We see them adopting or negotiating in various ways. For example, some parents have had no choice but to leave their children in unsafe environments because there were no other provisions made for them in that area, in that regard. You had parents taking their children with them to work where possible. You had mothers continuing to work from home where they can. You had children staying with grandparents, even though they may be vulnerable to the virus. And you had children being sent to stay with family members who were not really supervising this, their online learning. While we do not have data on the makeup of the informal sector in Barbados, we know that the Latin America and Caribbean estimates that 54%, at least 54% of the informal workforce is made up of women. Now, given the significant size of the informal economy in Barbados, we have to include that sector in our analysis. Non-governmental organizations working in the LGBTQI community have reported significant economic fallouts within the population due to the fact that many of their members work in hospitality or the cosmetology industry, or even as commercial sex workers. Many are in the informal sector. Families who are unaccepting of a relative's sexual orientation or gender identity may also use this time of depressed wages, coupled with the fact that government assistance will be filtered through the head of the household to issue ultimatums under threat of restricted resources. Some have even embarked on physical abuse or violence. There's also the issue of disability. Disability rights organizations note that people living with disabilities with jobs are very likely to be some of the first to be laid off in retrenchment exercises. Additionally, with an increased strain on their welfare department, persons living with disabilities who rely on government assistance may experience delays, which will impact food security and quality of life. Migrant women working off the books, some of whom may have been trafficked and are now sex workers, have felt that the government have brushed them aside. These women might be ineligible for welfare assistance, or may be afraid to seek out other forms of social welfare support or charity due to precarious or non-regularized immigrant status. These are real experiences of persons within our communities. This precarious time have, however, illustrated the power of women. Women mobilize, they come together in solidarity, and they help their communities. And this community work is fueled by voluntarism, which is really unpaid care work. We have NGOs such as the Barbados Association of Muslim Women, the National Organization of Women, Equals Barbados, Bajans Helping Bajans, and other community charity groups. And when I look at the organization of these groups, it's mainly women who seek assistance or receive assistance from, again, mainly women. And they have been doing a lot of good work in assisting persons in need across the country. So I really want us to understand that many women struggle with managing domestic and paid work expectations, but they get it done at the expense of their health, as Dr. Radix was showing, their mental and their physical health. Right now, what we are seeing is that women fear losing their jobs in these times. And so they go above and beyond to prove productivity, especially when they're in a space where, they're not visible to their bosses. Even before COVID, there was the experience of mothers in my study who were also struggling with these inequalities. It is quite clear that women have been stepping up to respond to the increased demands on their labor in this time of crisis. But the state's reliance on this kind of labor is really not one that can be sustained. So in conclusion, I want to encourage us to recognize that this is really a critical stage in the fight for gender equity. We heard it said by the ambassador in the opening remarks, by Tonni, even suggested by Dr. Radix. COVID-19 illustrates without a doubt the inequality experienced by women in societies. It strengthens the case not just for equality, but for equity, because we have to understand that specific groups of persons may be more in need or need something different than others. It also illustrates the pivotal role of women's care work to the economy And it shows how women mobilize and help their communities without government assistance. Imagine how much more they could do if governments offered recognition and assistance, if structures were changed to account for these diverse experiences, if women were given seats at the decision-making table. Just imagine. Let's build back, not just thinking around equality, but let's build back equitably. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bobb. That was really, really wonderful. Now for our question and answer session. We have a few questions from those of whom are tuning in on our live feed. The first of which is, what, if any, plans are in place to assist women newly unemployed as a result of COVID? For example, what, if any, stimulus or legal protections do you know about or would you suggest?
I think Tonni spoke to this earlier. Perhaps she can repeat some of
Yeah,
those.
sure. No problem. So there are the retraining programs that are happening, especially in Barbados, as I was saying, through the Government of Canada and the UK Aid in Gender Supported Program. We've also been able to give direct support through grants and different packages, support packages, to women and men across the Caribbean. It's not only the Eastern Caribbean, actually, that's also happening in Jamaica, as well as Guyana and Belize. So, and governments generally have been able to provide some kind of stimulus in terms of cash transfer programs where possible. The challenge, and I think it was Daniele who raised this, Dr. Bobb, very proud of the Dr. Bobb that raised it, is that a lot of the women who have been affected directly by COVID-19 are not in the formal economy, and therefore they are not easily located for these kinds of stimuli. So the example from Togo was used just for that reason. We have a challenge in our region that we need to work on with regards to legislation and policy so that M-money is actually something that can be done easily, because that is one of the challenges around digitization with payments, is how can we allow that to happen quickly so that persons who are not banked or who aren't as trusting of the banking system as they could be are brought into the system in a way that is easy for them through mobile money payments, which are also, as it happens, socially distant and friendly to any kind of hazard, COVID-19, or if a hurricane or something else was to happen, you also have the opportunity to use these kinds of transactions. So I do think that things are being done. Governments are moving in the right direction. We need additional things to be done to make things a little bit more smooth for additional support to reach more women and men.
Thank you. Next, Dr. Radix, I think this question is for you. What do you think is responsible for the increase of NDCs in women? And can stress be a factor, bearing in mind women's roles as caregivers or homemakers?
So the increasing rate of NCDs in women is also a reflection of the increasing rate of NCDs in the entire population. So women and men and children were all suffering from increases in NCDs related to several factors. Some of the risk factors that we talked about for NCDs, which include issues around physical inactivity, poor diet, substance abuse of alcohol and tobacco specifically, and underlying conditions around hypertension, which again is contributes to the disease. So stress is a factor for sure that contributes to non-communicable diseases. And please excuse my curtain over here. And so, yes, women do have an and do have issues around ability to get physical activity, what they're able to eat on the run, and all of these things are affected by their caregiving type responsibilities. So it's all intersected. But what I want to leave us with is that NCDs have been and continue to be an issue for women. We just tend to not recognize that issue in addition to all the issues that we have to deal with for women.
Great, thank you. And next question that we have is, will any programs with businesses and communities to help women deal with this impact? How can we, as the Eastern Caribbean, help them limit the impact and help them on the road to recovery? Open to whomever.
Sure, so I'll jump in again. I know that our colleagues at UNDP have recently launched a project called Future Tourism, and this is working with small and middle-sized enterprises owned by women and men. Mainly, as we've indicated, women own these kinds of enterprises in the Caribbean that are linked to tourism, to support their upskilling, to support their access to financial resources as well. So this is an Eastern Caribbean and Barbados project specifically to assist women dealing with this impact. UNWomen and UNICEF and WFP have been working with governments prior to COVID-19, and this was around the hurricane response. And I think this is also the strength of that Engender program that's supported by the Government of Canada and UK Aid, is that when you develop programs and policies and systems that are hazard as much as they could be proof, they will sustain any hazard like a COVID-19. So looking at shock responsive social protection that is also looking at childcare, unpaid care work. So we know where person's time is spent with regards to unpaid care work. So you can support the government in developing policies that are efficient and effective and evidence-based to address those gaps that we're seeing in the data. So there are a lot of programs that are happening. And I also want to speak, yesterday we did a program with USAID on juvenile justice. And this is also another way in which, because these economic disparities affect our citizen security. And if we're not doing the work to support and provide care for families early on, then we're going to start seeing all kinds of different impacts affecting our sustainable development. So there are a lot of different programs happening. Our goal now is to make sure that we see that return on investment for all of these programs so that it really serves women and men.
Perfect. Speaking of programs, both Tonni and Dr. Bobb, you talked about intimate partner violence as well as trafficked women and women in working environments where there might be elements of abuse or coercion or power and control. And I wonder, and obviously COVID, as you both have talked about, has really exacerbated some of the dynamics that allow for those instances to occur. And I wondered if you both could speak a little bit about what services you know are currently available for women in the Eastern Caribbean who may know of someone experiencing it or maybe experiencing themselves. And how do you think going forward, we as members in the Eastern Caribbean can better bolster services available to women in those situations?
Sorry, yes, thank you, Brianna. Good question and good point. During the pandemic, we've had reports from all non-governmental organizations speaking clearly around the increase, as Tonni mentioned, in the experiences of gender-based violence in homes and also intimate partner violence, because it's not just between persons in a relationship, but also children being affected by it. And we've had it's a very difficult situation to address because of the social distancing and the other protocols in place, especially looking again at how households are made up or structured within our Caribbean societies, where you may have extended families all residing together on the household, and enclosed or very limited space, no escape route in terms of, having to go out or go to the shop or just go and talk to the neighbor and those aspects. But what we've also seen is that you have a lot of work being done by activists and advocates on the ground at that level who are very intimately familiar with their environments, with their societies, with their communities in which they operate. And they've been finding ways to network and to navigate the system to get help and assistance to persons. In Barbados, I know the National Organization of Women have been lobbying heavily for, the establishment of safe homes, for safe spaces for women, especially in need. And even in some instances, some of those homes became very crowded and you had to make certain kinds of adjustments. But I also know in some societies in the Caribbean and internationally, what they've done is actually used different hotel sites to assist families, especially women and their children who may be in a very dangerous situation in their homes, and to house them there. Persons may say, why not ask the perpetrator of the violence to leave? But that's also very difficult because then they know where to come back, at what time to come back, in different times. So I know the women have been lobbying and doing work around that. There's been a network set up to assist persons who may be in those kinds of situations. There has been ads, put out. I saw last year there was a campaign actually online with different codes that persons can use to indicate that they need assistance, that they're living in an unsafe environment and they'll need some assistance. And different persons had different ways of, of getting that out there. But to offer assistance at the governmental level, that has been something I know we have been working on in the region for a very long time, and the work continues. But while that work is continuing, we are still lobbying and doing assisting persons in the communities in different ways, different non-governmental organizations, different groups, through our education, through our outreach, and just getting them the kinds of assistance and help that they would need.
I think everything that Daniele said, I think there are two things to this. There's also a positive spin, again, to the fact that we're seeing an increase in reporting. That means people are trusting the systems a little bit more so that they are reporting. Unless we have the prevalence data, we're not really sure that it is that cases are increasing. All we know is that more people are reporting. So that's one thing. The other thing is that a lot of governments across the Eastern Caribbean have instituted hotlines, toll-free hotlines. They have done public-private partnerships in some cases to establish this. They are doing their best to establish shelters, permanent shelters, because a lot of the shelters that have been established are not permanent shelters. And in some of the shelters, you're not allowed to bring your children. If your children are over a certain age, if you have a boy child who's over 14 or 15, he can't come, and not many parents would be willing to leave their child behind in a violent situation, so they'd probably stay with their child. The other issue that is happening, and I think it's a really good program, again, I keep referencing this program, but it's a very good program. The Engender program is a program that has been able to support directly counseling services, hotline calls for persons who are experiencing this, as well as PPE to go to the shelters so that their staff are well protected. UNWomen, PAHO, and UNFPA also developed guidelines for shelters because they, at the beginning of the pandemic, they weren't sure how to manage taking in new people with the COVID-19 pandemic, and more people were requesting. That said, it is great that we have the European Union funded Spotlight Initiative in the region. We do need more investment in violence against women and girls, both the prevention aspect of it, as well as the response access, because we need more shelters, we need more service provision generally, so that we see less of the escalation.
Great, thank you. We have time for about one more question. Dr. Radix, I just want to pivot to you. As we move past the pandemic, hopefully relatively soon, obviously there's been, to say the very least, a spotlight on health for the last year. How do you hope to talk about women's health, both in the context of the increased NCDs in the Caribbean, as well as COVID, and the fact that economic independence and autonomy are intricately linked to access to healthcare and being healthy?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, Brianna. And I saw a comment flashed across the screen and before the last question around whether or not there was an issue around increased miscarriages and if there was, with what does it mean in terms of sexual and reproductive health. And so I think you've captured it. And the thing is that, when we talk about our countries as small island developing states, and we talk about vulnerabilities, and every hit just exposes the vulnerability. And it's the same with women and health. So women have a set of vulnerabilities that my esteemed colleagues have shown exist. And so it means that our interaction with the health service exposes those vulnerabilities and compounds issues around health. And so with COVID-19, we've had, because the health service has been focused on a robust response to COVID-19, it's meant interruptions. I spoke to the interruptions in the NCD services, but there certainly have been interruptions in sexual and reproductive health services. So how women access services for issues around sexual and reproductive health in pregnancy, in events of miscarriages, etc., has been impacted as well by the COVID-19 pandemic, because the health system full of women has had to focus on what is the current priority, and it's exposed all of our vulnerabilities. So what I'm hoping, or what I'm seeing again, is that what I'm hoping is that we take advantage of the transformational opportunities for our health systems related to COVID-19. And one of those transformational opportunities is ensuring that health systems cater for women. Health systems have been built, they exist. I mean, there's so many words, there's so many things, there's so many pet peeves I can speak of, but have been built at a time when men ran systems. And we haven't, although we're all in the systems, we haven't been able to shift the systems to treat women's needs. And that includes accessibility, availability, and the actual health needs of women. So I see this as an opportunity. We're able to reach out and make certain things more accessible and available. And in the process of transforming, we need to make sure that women, the health system is equitable and meets the needs of both men and women.
Great. Thank you so much. And thank you so much, you guys. I want to wrap up and say thank you so much to everybody, to our panelists, Representative Brodber, Dr. Radix, and Dr. Bobb, to our participants, and to those of you who have tuned in. Thank you to our collaborative partners at the Canadian High Commission. And thank you to the Public Affairs section, as well as the Diversity and Inclusion Committee at the U.S. Embassy, both of whom were integral in making this program happen. And thank you again to our U.S. Ambassador for your introduction and support. Finally, to close out our program, I have the honor of introducing the Canadian High Commissioner Designee to Barbados, Lillian Chatterjee. Prior to her designation in Barbados, she was a High Commissioner to Guyana with a concurrent accreditation and CARICOM, and has championed health and equitable workplaces throughout her career. Welcome, High Commissioner, and thank you for being here today.
Thank you. What a great discussion, and I'd like to thank everyone who joined in to listen to this discussion, and thank you especially to all the speakers. And I'd like to start off by thanking Ambassador Tagliatella for her contribution, but also for the U.S. Embassy colleagues who have worked very closely with the Canadian Embassy colleagues in putting this together. And I've been following the comments that have been made by the participants, and it seems that they all agree too that it has been a great discussion. So thank you. It's also a pleasure. First of all, we've worked with the U.S. Embassy on so many different initiatives, but this is our first virtual event together. So it's a first for me and a first for our High Commission working with the U.S. Embassy. It's also a pleasure to work with our colleagues here in Barbados and be joined by these experts, stakeholders, and partners in the wider region. Listening to the discussions, several key items resonated with me. The double burden the pandemic has placed on women's shoulders, we all know about that. The need for public policy that recognizes the gendered effect of the so-called she session and avoid losing those hard-fought gains. The role that the private sector has to play in adopting inclusive and flexible labor practices for employees, some of which that will become permanent fixtures in our workplaces, we hope. As always, the need to engage men as champions, so many of you have raised that, for gender equality and equitable economic participation. The economic arguments for more inclusive economic empowerment are compelling, and we need to tell that story better. And how vital partnership is. We need to sustain and build a concerted movement to advancing women's economic empowerment through the crisis and beyond. I look forward to our continued collaboration as partners and allies to advance these issues and build back better. Thank you very much, and I look forward to seeing many of you in person as soon as possible. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much, everybody, for joining us today. I think this was a really wonderful discussion on a very important topic, wrapping up Women's History Month 2021. I think some of the main themes have been, it's been in many ways a pretty rough year given the pandemic and housing in place and social distancing, et cetera. But I think with that comes great opportunity. And I hope that not only everybody here who spoke, but everybody listening is prepared and excited about the opportunities going forward to grow equality, both in the labor market as well as in all measurable ways for women.